Hi.
Hi.
Sorry we were a bit slow to get in here. We had some issues with, there's like a little tiny like bit that needs to go from like the phone to the headphones, and I have no idea where it is.
Typical. Typical.
Typical, yeah, exactly. The joys of technology. How are you two?
Good.
Doing well. Doing well. We're down to the last few hours of install, so there's always like this little detail, that little detail. So you might see a few of those as we walk around.
Oh, that's always the fun part, is seeing those little details. Those little, like, this is what it actually looks like to put something like this together.
Definitely.
So, welcome to Flat Files. This is our weekly live stream where we chat with usually artists. Today's a bit different, so we're pretty excited about that. And we usually do a little bit of a studio tour and a talk about practice. So today we're meeting with curators, not that you're not also artists, but in this capacity we're talking as curators at the Agnes Etherington Art Centre, Sunny and Michelle. And so we usually pass it over to our guests to kind of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about, in this case, the curation of this exhibition.
Is that Tona?
Yeah.
Great. We had a little bit of internet issue there, but I got the sense that we're meant to talk about ourselves right now for a little bit.
You go first.
Okay, yeah. I'll move a little bit away from this audio here, but so I'm Michelle Bunton. I'm curatorial assistant artist residencies at Agnes, and this is my first project that I'm co-curating with Sunny. And so my role at Agnes started off working on Drift Art and Dark Matter, which was a residency and exhibition project that brought national and international artists together to travel to Sudbury and go 2 kilometers underneath the surface of the earth to look at the dark matter research that was being done underground. And so that was a very interesting and sort of once-in-a-lifetime residency experience, and then that culminated in an exhibition project here at Agnes. And sort of coming out of themes from that project was Dark Matter Playgroup, which was also a micro-residency. And that's the micro-residency that you both were a part of and has led to this exhibition, Superradiance. And so that residency project, we really wanted to create something that was responsive to the pandemic context, making work within a pandemic context, that could happen in multiple locations, across distances, with multiple artists, be flexible and ambulatory, and part of that process meant bringing in artist mentors, one of whom was a part of Drift Art and Dark Matter, Joel Toms. There's also Elvira Hufschmid and Nevin Lockheed. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the residency process, but residencies are sort of my jam here, and that's what I've been working on a lot. But I'm going to flip the camera, or actually I'll just pass my phone off to Sunny and I'll let him introduce himself.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Sunny Kerr, and I've been working here at Agnes for about 6 or 7 years or so, and as curator of contemporary art. And I guess, well, as you implied, Chrissy, my background is as an artist, and I occasionally show work, and I for several years there, that was my main thing. But this is my main thing now, and I guess by way of background for this project, Superradiance, to just add on to what Michelle said about the residency, residencies have been a big focus for me since starting here at Agnes 6 or 7 years ago. And I guess I kind of increasingly got uncomfortable or tired with the rhythms of exhibition making. So just having one project that's sort of intensely focused on a particular subject matter that that we learn so much from, and then it's done and it goes away.
Yeah.
And we move on to another one that is equally intense and equally exciting. So it occurred to me some time ago that we could learn more if we extend these and overlap them and let them kind of influence each other. So that was part of the impulse, and it was actually through a previous sort of model that I first worked with Michelle. It was a project that we did with Modern Fuel called Your Own Grad School, which was a project by Gene Randolph and Cliff Eland.
Yeah.
Which was essentially, and maybe you know about it. Essentially, it was getting artists together and saying we don't need to go to art school. We need, a structure. We need mentors. We can organize this ourselves. And so
I love that concept.
Yeah, and so we've been trying to sort of create our sort of homegrown version of that since. And
Yeah.
so this idea of playgroup is a way to bring back the spirit of Your Own Grad School and like a space for artists to think together, to make together, sometimes around particular subjects. And as the pandemic hit, as Michelle said, it became more and more clear that this was a way of working that was going to serve artists better potentially, and the pandemic really made those sort of discrete time blocks seem absurd as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, no kidding. Can you talk a little bit about like what drew you both to working with this idea of dark matter initially? Like what connected you to the Snow Lab group and
Perform what drift art
yeah,
dark matter?
That's such an interesting collaboration. And I don't really actually know how you got there initially.
Uh-huh. Well, initially it was through an invitation from McDonald Institute here at Queen's, and who's a close partner with Snow Lab, the laboratory. And so they were interested in inviting artists into the labs to learn about the science. But I mean, for them, I think it really was an interest in making the science clear to publics and making sort of avenues and access points for people to learn what's going on in the dark matter science in Canada, astroparticle physics in general in Canada, and also give people a different way into it that
Right.
You don't need to be a scientist to get that introduction. And so that was really the reason for us, and it was such an exciting idea that we couldn't refuse. It was the idea of thinking about dark matter, the idea of going underground to think about dark matter, just amazing. And so,
Yeah.
Personally, I think that one of the things that art museums, institutions need to do is to extend ourselves. We're not just the place for expression of a sort of lineage of art history. We're just not just the place for a kind of rarefied beauty. We are a place for thinking about what it means to create knowledge, about thinking about forms of research, thinking about what art and science share in general. And so I think it's our role to really kind of work in those kind of extended hybrid sorts of spaces.
That's awesome. I also like loved that relationship and that connection of like trying to like share knowledge in a new way, share very complex knowledge in a new way, bring I think that in schools I'm always interested when disciplines kind of cross over and talk with each other. And from our experience, like working with the workshop leaders that you all brought together, that sort of extended way past, like way further than I like expected and anticipated, which was just like such an eye-opening experience, because it didn't limit itself to like just this conversation about like dark matter research, physics research, science in Canada, because you had artists like having that conversation, it turned into, you know, a discussion about land usage. It was a discussion about ethics. It was a discussion about history, our relationship, like where those all cross paths, like how does ethics, history, land, and science intersect with one another, and where are those boundaries? It was just such a I mean, I think I've talked to both of you about how it was like almost too much of a mind-blowing experience for me, that I felt overwhelmed in moments, because it was just a lot of new information to digest and process. Yeah, it's a really fascinating program that you've developed through how many, it's been 3 years? I'm trying to remember the first time I talked to Zach Kenny, who maybe is still on here, about the Drift project.
Yeah, it was 2018 when
Yeah. So it's been going on for quite a while. Oh my gosh, so exciting. Sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Oh no, I was just going to say, and these sort of transdisciplinary projects often do take time. There's a lot of trust building that happens in these projects because you're coming from different disciplines and different ways of working and bringing your own methodologies. And it's also sort of getting comfortable with sitting with that sort of unknown as well, the sort of unknown that each discipline brings to the discussion.
Yeah. How has this been for you, Michelle, as like sort of like a newish part of your practice and part of your art career path?
Well, I've always been really interested in transdisciplinary residencies. Since I left school, I guess in 2017, I've been working with either as an artist in residence or as an expedition leader with IATANA, which is a scientific research-based artist residency. So it brings together artists interested in science and connects them with different leaders in the field or researchers at universities or artists who are also working with different biological or scientific concepts. And in my own practice, I've always been really interested in working with physics and the sort of poetic implications that might have, or just it's been very fascinating to me. So it kind of doesn't necessarily feel like something new, just something that's kind of on a trajectory that I was already working toward, maybe. Like the conversations around Drift and Dark Matter, the early conversations, felt quite natural, that sort of aligned with things that I'd already been thinking about, or questions I'd already been asking myself. And so, but I mean, obviously working at an institution like Agnes, there's a lot of resources, and it's quite large, and the project has a much larger scale than something like a smaller residency out in rural Quebec.
Right.
So it's been really exciting, and I mean, working on Superradiance has definitely been new for me, having more of a balanced role, curatorial role, has been a new experience for sure. And kind of that relationship building that happens with artists over the duration of the residency, and then translating that into an exhibition space is an interesting task to engage with. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Shall we go on a little tour?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's see if I can figure out how to flip this camera. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Hey.
Where should we start? Do you want me to give you the...
Well, we could. We're sort of looking at Kyle Topping work right here, aren't we? So we could take a closer look, and maybe Kyle, you could. I don't want to jump in and speak for you, so we could at least let you. Say a few things about
I would love to chat about this stuff. So this work here is called Stone Cycle. It's a polymer plate relief that I made quite a few years ago, but it was one of the first in kind of the series of environmental work that I was interested in. And this was happening right around the time that Nestle was, well, still is, sucking the aquifer pretty dry. And so I made this print where there's these kind of fat cat bureaucrats, and they're sucking all of the water dry, while these kind of workers do all the work, and they just kind of sit. Yeah, I made this, like, I think really in response to what Nestle was doing, or I guess still is doing.
That's cool. We have a very interesting coincidence here, because next door we have an exhibition about humor in, well, mostly historical French prints.
I know. I snuck in there and was just like kind of poking around. I was like, oh, look, there's just a really cool exhibition beside my work. Excellent.
Yeah. And there are quite a few satirical portrayals of like bourgeois men in coats and top hats. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
I love that. This piece is called Terraforming. It's a 4-color screen print. And I was really trying to kind of look about this relationship between the environment and anatomy. And so there are these two kind of iceberg, they're cross sections of like one being still whole and the other one being melted, and these two lungs below it that are either filled or not filled. And so as I think the icebergs melt, we are going to kind of experience like, a pretty steady decline in our health as a world. And so I was trying to create a relationship between those two different things.
Thanks, Zach.
Hi, Zach. Just stepping around Michelle here to look at this work. Speaking of icebergs, although these are like islands, aren't they?
They become a little bit
Floating
more.
city.
So like something I started thinking about was, this relationship to kind of the changing planet of Earth and how we are slowly flooding it. And I kind of thought about, well, like, what are some of the ways that perhaps technology might adapt to this and how humans will inevitably adapt? And so I thought it would be really cool if there was this big giant 3D printer barge that would just float around the world and print new strips of land. So that's how humans might adapt in the future to essentially a water world.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of one of the conversations we had with Josefa and Jam, who was in the Drift project. She was really inspired by Battlestar Galactica because, they're the last remaining humans getting chased around space with no land.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was not even a prospect of terraforming or making some kind of location. But here you have a kind of magical sort of nomadic technological terraforming.
It's true.
Yeah, I really liked how that print was probably one of the first ones that I made that was very successful. I think about kind of trying to bridge technology, science, and environment together. I've like kind of done a little bit before, but like I was really proud of how this one related those two concepts together. And I think it kind of like started me down a little bit of a path, making kind of work that's more technology based or technology referential. It's not real science, guys. It's all fictional science.
Right. Oh, I do get to look at this piece now and then look at GH1 as well, because your piece here is one of two fountains in this room, or something like a fountain.
Yeah.
Which is a lovely coincidence.
So this was actually the piece I created for Superradiance, and it's called
Limitless Water.
Yeah, Limitless Water. It's a screen print, and this print kind of started from the workshops that you guys had facilitated, and the Joel Tom's workshop. He brought up a lot of kind of an interesting talking point about the relationship of like science organizations and the land and like where those science organizations are located. And we got onto a conversation about a dam, and I cannot remember where it is.
Oh, Manicouagan, Quebec.
Yes. And there was like, yeah, there was like something really cool about that. And that led me down this kind of path about power generation and kind of addressing some like the future energy problems. And I've created this Limitless Water. It's kind of satirical in that this cannot work on a physics basis, but this idea that like a pool would like flood into a space would generate a turbine, which would be picked up by a corkscrew, which would be turned into a jet and like spit back out. And it would create like a cycle of water that would generate more energy than it consumes. And I don't think the science works. I'm very 100% sure that the science doesn't work on that, and there's a reason why you can only put so many dams on a river. but I'm like really curious about the kind of what's going to happen with technology and energy usage. And Chrissy and I had been talking actually on the car ride back from my cottage yesterday about like just the sheer amount of like energy power that new things are starting to use. Like I was talking to her about Bitcoin using the energy of essentially Sweden, I think. And like we're coming into a really big crisis about energy, and like things are going to be looking towards fusion. And I started thinking about like tidal generation, and it was really cool that I think it was recently they just built the world's largest tidal generator, which is super cool because it's a really, well, it's a pretty renewable energy source. And so I really like energy, and I really like thinking about this kind of problem.
Oh, wait. Well, Kyle, it's interesting to oh, I keep hitting it twice. um, Speaking of superradiance, though, in relation to what you just said, you know, this kind of fantasy of the kind of limitless water, because the idea for the show came to us in reference to the kind of energy of a collective. And the way that, you know, even if you think you enter a room and you're not going to agree with this group, eventually you kind of come to this kind of magical sense of cohesion. I don't know if this happened to you before, maybe working with artists while printing, maybe if you're playing in a band or something and suddenly you click. There's a kind of surplus energy. And this is the idea of superradiance in a way, is that scientists have detected this kind of unexpected surplus of energy, extra energy, more than would occur, you know, if you just added up the energy from a number of atoms. There's a kind of extra coherent wave that they've detected. And I was reading recently that scientists are speculating about how there's a potential for limitless energy if you kind of just skim the edge of a black hole, because there's a super radiant expenditure there, and it could sort of shoot you off with more energy. So that's part of the in general a kind of fantasy that I think is that you're playing out in this work, and is kind of animating this idea of superradiance too.
Yeah.
Love that.
Michelle, do you want to take a look at the next fountain piece?
Yeah, here, I can grab the camera here.
You're doing great.
So this is GHY Cheung's work for the exhibition. I'm just going to give a sort of general view of it first before we get into close. And it's fitting that we go from the last work, Kyle, to this piece here, because GHY is kind of also playing with the creation of some sort of new fantastical, but in this case, a new bathroom fixture. So imagining mixing together different wet places to create some sort of bathroom fixture for the future that might lead to new encounters or to new forms of intimacy that could take place if it was combined with the aesthetics of, say, a bathhouse and a sauna and a washroom and all these sort of different wet spaces that we encounter today. And so I'm just showing the sort of very subtle tile work that GHY has painted on these plinths here. And they're almost undetectable except for the sort of gloss that comes out in the light.
Yeah.
The lighting turned out really well.
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
It was, we played with a lot of different lighting possibilities and ended up finding these lights that look quite similar to the TVs themselves, actually, and work very well for the piece. And they're meant to be kitchen lights, I think, so that's another maybe sort of semi-wet place as well. Yeah, and so then you can see, I'll kind of stay on one of these TVs for a moment here, and you can watch the video cycle through. But there's this sort of, I'm not sure if you can pick up the audio as well, this steady.
You can. Yeah.
Trickle. I'll be quiet for a moment so that you can listen.
I love the way that they're tilted. So it's like they're kind of looking away from you. Because when I think of washrooms as a wet place, I think, especially if they're not my own, they're very like awkward and uncomfortable place.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you do, if you stand over them, I mean, you'll see me reflected in the screen as well, so you kind of are faced with yourself in the piece too. Your reflection kind of gets transplanted onto the stream of water. And you can see, like I can see Sunny standing behind me, for example. In the same way you might encounter a mirror in a bathroom.
I think that was something that was so interesting and surprising about like the way that we all like kind of came to a conclusion about what we were going to make for this exhibition was that almost accidentally like water became like an element of discussion, or an element that sort of just like weaseled its way into every conversation. Like even with mine, it is in no way intentionally referencing water, but Michelle and I were talking about how it kind of unintentionally feels like under the sea, which was not at all the point. But I just think that was like a very like curious thing that happened with all of us.
Yeah, maybe we should bring the camera to your work now while we're talking about it. But yeah, there's definitely something sort of aquatic about the work in a way. And it's true that sort of imagery seems to have cropped up in everyone's work, and it kind of speaks to what Sunny was describing about whether it's sort of conscious or verbally agreed upon or not, there's this sort of coherence that happens when you're working in a group.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
so yeah,
let me walk through there.
So I ended up making an augmented reality work, which is completely outside of my usual repertoire. So the thing that I kind of landed on right at the beginning when like first asked to participate in this, and honestly through talking a lot with Zach even before, Zach Kenny, who like works with the physics team. Zach, I'm not even going to try to describe like what exactly your capacity is and what you do there, because I honestly am not 100% clear about that, but I do know that you that you're there and you do stuff with the physics department at Queen's. I think it has to do with like telling people what they're doing to the public, but I don't know that 100%. But anyways, we talked a lot, Zach and I and Kyle, over like since 2018 about this really beautiful project that you've all been working on, where you're bringing art and physics and dark matter together. And a crying face and a thumbs up. All right, I did so-so. But something that, like, because I don't really know an awful lot about physics, but I find it to be, like, one of the most, like, magical and fascinating, like, science realms. And this particular conversation about dark matter, this, like, idea that there's a matter that clearly exists that we, like, cannot in any way see, feel, or even detect as of right now, kind of blew my mind. And when we kept talking with all of the different workshop like leaders in this micro-residency, the other thing that I really loved was all these conversations about like hidden history, like sort of like undiscussed narratives by people that just don't get a lot of like screen time or dedication in museums, in books, in literature, and how like in a lot of different ways we just miss a lot of information because sometimes we might not be looking in the right place, or we just might not be looking at all. And so that's where I kind of grabbed onto for my project. So the AR, even though it's not a medium that I really knew how to work in, seemed like an interesting way to reflect that. So having visuals that exist in the space, but unless you're like trying to find them and looking in the right way, they're not visible to you at all. It created an interesting set of challenges because, you know, Michelle and I and Sunny and Leah all recognized pretty quickly that like the software and the iPads are not the easiest things to set up in a public space, like to not have people touch them, to make sure that people aren't walking around and only viewing the show through an iPhone. The dangers of that just from like a literal mechanical level, like tripping over things or wrecking something, but also from like a distraction level when reading the other works in the space. And then just like the internet usage and keeping it playing and all these like little elements that as like a painter or an installation artist where I'm mostly working with paper, I've never had to encounter. So that was like a really like fascinating and like steep learning curve. But in the end, I think like it's a really, I'm very excited about making a piece like this and just having worked with like the team at the Agnes who were just endlessly supportive of every little glitch, every little like artist concern that I had. It was just like the most supportive and I guess like, I don't want to say loving because that seems sort of weird, but I just felt really cared for and supported no matter like what silly question or concern I seemed to throw at them. They just like always had an answer or were always like really good about like, yeah, like kind of holding my hand through it and being like, we got this, like it's going to be good. And so, yeah, it was a great place and a great time to try something really different. So that's what I ended up working on.
That's really lovely to hear. And yeah, it's, I mean, a residency is always a good opportunity to try something new, and the pandemic kind of adds another layer of maybe motivation for that too. And like wrestling with the new technological form is always challenging, but it's always exciting and rewarding in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was fortunate, again, Zach, you really like, I gotta give Zach as many props as possible for this because he was the one that ended up pointing me to Adobe Aero, which is the system that I ended up using, which thankfully right now is in its beta phase, so it's free. So like the public can download the app for free and view, you know, lots of different AR projects, including this one, which I have to get Sunny and Michelle the links to. But then it also meant that I could explore this material in this program, not at a steep cost, because some of the other AR programs that are used, especially in like galleries and museums, are really steep. Like some of them were like $1,000 a month for a certain number of like viewers or people using the software. So, you know, that was very lucky, and I'm super grateful that that was the case for this particular piece because it meant that I could play without being too stressed out about it.
It worked out beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad, Chrissy, to get your testimonial on video, on record as well.
Of course.
Should we spend a few minutes, because I see
Yeah.
we're at 1:45. I want to make sure we talk about this lovely work by Andy Berg and the installation by Noah Scheinman, and also Bicky Marquez's work. We have,
Yes.
we'll have a few minutes for each, and so.
That's okay. We can go over the time a little bit. It doesn't cut us off. So
Cool.
we're good.
Wonderful. Okay, well, you saw it through Chrissy's AR piece. There's a large ceramic installation on the floor here by artist Andy Berg, and I'm going to kind of bend down and give us a closer look at it. The piece is called Missing Reservoir, and it's constructed with these many twisted ceramic and glazed wave forms. And then around the circle of waves there are these creatures that Andy refers to as entities. And they're all hollow, and in a way they seem like they are animal skulls, but they aren't necessarily referring directly to any real animals. In fact, they are kind of more like speculative creatures, entirely fantasy constructed creatures, and each one is also glazed on the inside, and there's a sort of a play of light from above. And so they feel like skulls. Some of them do look like animals. Like this feels like it might be a beaver-like skull. This one here has a beak that's snapped off, intentionally separated here. Some of them feel like, I don't know, some kind of also deep sea something, hybrid plant animal sort of creature. And Andy was interested in these kind of representing animal spirits or spirits of entities or agents that have lost their home territory. And so, like you, Andy was inspired by the workshop with Joel Toms, especially around thinking about this particular site in Quebec, the Manicouagan Reservoir. And so that was kind of a real jumping off point for Andy to start thinking about a response. I'll take you a little bit closer here. There are always these red dots in the center, which Andy explained to us are kind of a prehistoric, anthropologically recognized kind of symbol of mourning across many cultures.
Oh, wow. I also love that Andy chose to do a ceramic piece that is on the floor. I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that before.
We certainly haven't exhibited anything like this, quite like this before at all, that's for sure. Yeah, and so it has this kind of gentle, rippling quality to it with these steadfast, kind of colorful entities. One kind of looks like a frog or like some kind of salamander. It's Michelle's idea.
What's nice too is it really does, like having been in there for days with that piece, it does really pull you in. Like it makes you want to get on the level with the pieces and explore them really closely, and to have the opportunity to do that in a public space for material that's so fragile like ceramics, it was just a really different viewing experience. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, and it's very much intentional. I mean, especially considering that the work, the early title for the work was Sacral Reservoir, and sacral referring to like sort of bottom half of the body, and to where water would rest in a reservoir, and so it's again, it's water finding its level. Yeah, and so maybe do you want to speak to Bicky's work, and then I'll finish with Noah? Yeah. I can hold this if you want.
And so Bicky Marquez is a physicist as well as a painter, and her work is often inspired by chaos theory and chaotic attractors. And chaotic attractors are this sort of curving pattern that comes out of a seemingly chaotic set of data, but there is a sort of underlying pattern within it. And so you can see the sort of curving forms in her work, and it kind of wraps itself into this very intestinal piece, and the sort of shapes and forms from this work actually kind of come out of one of Elvira Hushman's workshops, I feel like, where it was this kind of exquisite corpse methodology where you guys were encouraged to go see Drift and Dark Matter and create a response to one of the works, and then respond to someone's response, and kind of carry through that trajectory. And Bicky ended up creating a work that had these curving forms, kind of these limbs folding in over themselves. And this work flows into the final piece of the triptych here. Yeah, and it's interesting again, there's, even though you were all working separately, a lot of these forms and colors and tonalities speak to Andy's work, and even your work too, you can see it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of Bicky's areas of research is artificial intelligence, and she's especially interested in whether or not computers can recognize, truly recognize faces, or truly understand what might be expressed by faces.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of this work, as you saw even with the first, is about a kind of fragmentation and reconstruction of a face. And I'm quite interested in how that's it's leaking across a lot of the work in the sense that there's a way in which discrete bodies are no longer considered so discrete, but have this kind of sharing of energy somehow across them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved that Bicky had, truly had this combination of an art practice and a serious physics practice. That was, such a lovely addition to the group. And I had the good fortune of being able to work with her on, a 3-person team. And just, listening to the way that she thinks about her art and the way that she sees it relating to like you said, her work in AI, it was just such a different way of thinking about a practice. And I don't know anything about artificial intelligence, so I was writing down so much of the phrases and things she was talking about to research later. Yeah, it was a really fascinating exchange.
Yeah, and so these are 2 other pieces of Bicky's as well from an earlier series. So Spirals 1 and Spirals 2, and they're definitely dealing with sort of interiority, and have these sort of spaces kind of folding in on themselves and falling apart and coming together in this curving and sort of chaotic attractor curving form. Yeah, and a lot of very similar palette colors as well being used, and it's funny how that just sort of happened with each of the artists.
Yeah, it is actually. So cool.
Yeah, and across the room, do you want to hold it? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We have an installation by Noah Scheinman, also an artist originally from Houston and from this area. And this video piece is called Banter, Part 1, The Legacy of the Matter. And it's...
I think we're losing a little bit of the audio just from the distance.
I'll come closer. It's called Bad Earth, The Legacy of Matter. And it's partly formed out of a kind of documentary research practice Noah undertakes in his work generally, but in this case undertook in the town of Port Hope, Ontario, not too distant from us, or especially from you folks in Picton. Because Port Hope rather has a history of storing, burying nuclear waste, and also being this, very picturesque and cheerful little town at the same time. So there's a certain kind of sinister vibe here. Noah's footage shows the actual sites of containment. You may not know if you're just looking, but containment of nuclear waste. And in general, he was employing this kind of metaphor of the weather, because the weather is something that is really just all around us all the time, whether we notice it or not. And you know, and of course we now know that the weather is something that we have some effects on. And so the rectangle that you see around the central rectangle, you can't really see it right now, but there's footage of this kind of set of streaming clouds usually that are going past.
Mm-hmm.
And those clouds are from Port Hope's theater. There's a theater in Port Hope that has this really interesting device that projects the weather on the ceiling of the theater. I don't know if you know about this theater, but I'm not sure if they still do that, but they still have the technology. It's sort of an antiquated projection technology with this disc that rotates and creates the impression of weather on the ceiling, the simulation of weather on the ceiling in the theater. And so Noah was very interested in that as a kind of extension of his interest in, you know, the weather as a metaphor for the reality of Port Hope.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you'll see it in a moment. You'll see the clouds once again.
Yeah, you can see them floating, like, especially if you look above the projection of the main projection, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's also this interesting play constantly between something being in front or being behind. That's intentional here. And maybe we'll make it.
There's also a full audio component to that, where like it's, from what I remember, like kind of like a documentarian type discussion about like nuclear in, I don't know if it's specific to Port Hope or if I.
Right. Yeah, much of it is specific, but you're right. Yeah, Canada's history with nuclear and the nuclear waste. We turned that down just so that we could hear ourselves and you could hear us, but I'll turn it up now so you can hear more of it. There are also these kind of constant hums, which is also a nice way of kind of figuring this presence of this material that you don't actually notice. It becomes and so we're looking at some fabric works also by Noah Scheinman that are called Study for Garment, and they are constructed out of geosynthetic materials that are actually used in the process of containing this kind of leakage or diffusion of toxic waste. So he was able to source some of those and construct what he described as being like blankets or being like Study for Garments is the title. Essentially, he was trying to connect them, I think, with the body, rather than being like flags or banners or something. They're meant to be more related to more intimate in a way, like clothing or like.
Okay. The patterning that he decided to work with, like the stripes and the circles, was that referencing anything, or was that again just kind of to make it feel like more like a home object?
That's my impression. I don't think he wasn't using any specific iconography, for the sake of conveying any particular message that way. The only one I think that really gets across is the kind of safety yellow, because we really do recognize that as a sign to, be cautious, be careful. Especially
how do they use this
on
material?
someone's body. Pardon?
How do they use this material?
I think some of it's actually lining waste sites, like actually containing materials. If I'm not mistaken, it's kind of engineered entirely for that kind of purpose.
So part of Port Hope's like long history with nuclear is that it extends before World War II, where like I think Canada's like the biggest producer of like enriched uranium for quite a while. And so like with this plant and facility, I think it's right on the waterfront of Port Hope. Like the town has slowly become a little bit contaminated over almost a century, I imagine at this point, with like nuclear waste. And so what they have had to do is remediate a lot of the land within the town, like physically dig it up and transport it to these gigantic, they're not holding things, they're like these huge fields that they've been engineered with this lining material that Noah has in his artwork here to that they're like massive, and so it's meant to like kind of store it and just kind of keep it from leaching back out into the surrounding environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kyle, I sometimes draw comparisons to the way that in your work you portray this kind of hopeless and fruitless effort to control nature. You know, there's a real kind of machine-like takeover of natural spaces that, you know, in your work is it's kind of fantastical, but it's also it seems to me like a kind of satire because it's framed in such an absurd way. So there's a real connection there.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so like these are pictures, like there was a big issue with radiation on one of the public schools, I believe, and they had to like do a huge like reclamation of that area, and like many of the houses as well in the area.
That's right. Actually, Andy Berg, whose work this is behind us, lived in Port Hope when they discovered that a whole annex that they constructed of that school was made from material that was, you know, taken right from the waste sites, and people used to hang out there and, you know, reuse the materials all the time.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's amazing how like I don't know if that's a product of us not understanding the hazards associated with it, or just like a negligence.
No.
What is the word? Negligence.
Yeah.
There we go. But like, there's a lot of stories in that area about that waste being reused to like fill up like lots and things like that.
Mm-hmm. That's right, and we started to think about what are the things that we do that with now. You know, what are we not seeing? What are we taking for granted in the same way? You know, carelessly.
Yeah. No, I think that's like was a really interesting part of all the conversations that were had like over the course of the residency, was like just trying to notice what we aren't noticing and be open to that conversation, as like uncomfortable as it can be sometimes, because, you know, I'm sure in Port Hope it's like an uncomfortable history to like try to navigate, especially if you really love it there, and maybe some people don't really love the way that element of the area has been managed. It's so valuable to just like be reflecting on it and trying to like ask those questions and think about what you're doing. And I felt like a lot of the conversations, even if it wasn't like directly that, like you were mentioning with Elvira's workshop, it was about like, okay, everybody go look at the same show and then pick something from that show that resonated with you and try to express that resonance visually somehow, and then show your expression to the group, and they get to then look at your piece and repeat back to you what was the most valuable part of what you showed them, and then do that again. And what I loved about what she did is like, as it kept going down through the line, it was like becoming more and more distilled. You know, like I might have done something that had a whole bunch of marks, but there were 3 really valuable marks that then Andy reflected on. And then when Andy showed that to like Noah or whoever, maybe only 2 of those marks were actually the most important marks or the most important part of the conversation. And it really like stripped down like maybe a complicated idea to whatever was really like constantly humming out, referring back to that hum in the room to everybody, which was a really interesting way of working and something I'd never done before. And I think talks a lot to how this whole show came together and how it connects back to its original place.
Yeah, that sort of translation process and what's lost or carried forward or latched onto in different ways.
Yeah, and what we really want to look at and what we're like kind of okay ignoring. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even ignoring, but just being comfortable with the not knowing something.
Yeah.
Being like, I'm interested in this, I want to carry it forward, but I don't need to possess it or know it in a tangible way, right?
Totally. That's a great way of looking at it. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to walk us through, for inviting us to be part of something that has been such a wonderful experience.
So if you could tell us again, like when the show opens and how the public might be able to access it, and maybe could you talk about like what the Agnes Etherington is doing for like what kind of protocols or like what a comer to the gallery should expect?
Right, so, well, we're opening tomorrow, so Saturday, August 7th. We have our regular business hours, which I hope I can remember. It's been a while since we've had to consider them. But in general, visiting the gallery, it's sort of the same way that you would be visiting a lot of places right now during the pandemic. So bring your masks, there'll be hand sanitizer. We have a limited capacity, but all of our reception staff will let you know if you're good to go ahead and walk through the spaces. And Sunny's just pulling
It's
up.
on, and it's on until the 7th of November.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so Thursdays we're typically open later, so if people are working and busy during the day, Thursday is a good day to come if you can't visit on the weekend. And there's lots of wonderful exhibitions opening up at Agnes as well. It's a really exciting time to be. We've all been eagerly anticipating being able to open our doors again to the public.
Yeah, the piece that's in the room before you enter the space with like Noah, Bicky, Andy, and I looks amazing. Oh my gosh.
I'll wait till you see it now. It's on.
Oh, it's way different than when I was there the other day.
Oh, very, very
Oh
different.
my gosh. Okay. I was wondering what all those stands were going to be doing.
Yeah. This show is called With Opened Mouths, and it's curated by Dr. Kenita Lila, who's our new curator of Arts of Africa. And this is a presentation of the collections, the masks, or a selection of masks from the Lang collection.
Oh, wow. Sweet. Yeah, it looked really gorgeous. And there's also another projection that was on, I'm assuming will be on the walls. It's very gripping being in there. I was watching as they were laying out the thing on the floor, which now looks like it's covered in sand or something.
Foil.
It's earth.
Oil. Yeah. That's what was happening when I was last there. Was trying to they were trying to map this area out.
Cool.
And I'll point to the vinyl as well here. So you might recognize, we have a podcast right now on our website for With Open Mouths as well, so you might recognize the text and sort of design. But yeah.
Wonderful.
It's an exciting time for Agnes again.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for spending the afternoon with us chatting, and we'll let you get back to putting up vinyl and all the finishing touches. And we'll talk to you soon. Have a lovely weekend.
You too. Thank you too. That was really fun and enlightening. So yeah.
Sweet. All right.
Bye.
Bye.